What is the political response to any of this regarding the sort of mainstream? In other words, orient us a little bit in sort of mainstream politics in Germany, defined by the mainstream parties. What is their take on any of this? Is it pure denial from, say, the Greens or maybe the Christian Democrats? How does the mainstream political landscape process or address any of the decline in Germany as you describe it?
Well, of course they address it. Like you have Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor. He's from the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union.
Right.
Like nominally a conservative party.
Right.
But in reality, like a hardcore leftist party, I would argue, because
Okay.
you have a multi-party system in Germany, right? Like you have now the CDU is in a coalition with the Social Democrats, right? So in the last federal election, the CDU came first place with like over 30%. The AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the patriotic opposition party, actually came in second place at like 20 or 25%. The Social Democrats, the SPD, came in at like 15, 16%, right? So if you had like a normal democratic system, you would think, right, that the two strongest parties would enter into a coalition, especially considering that the Christian Democratic Union, Chancellor Merz's party, is officially conservative, as is the AfD, while the Social Democrats are not.
Yes.
But of course, in Germany, you have what the establishment parties call a firewall, right? Where they basically say that they cannot work together or collaborate or enter into a coalition with the AfD.
Period.
They just won't do it.
Right.
And this is, by the way, it's interesting because like in the morning I drive my children to school. Sometimes I listen to the radio, just like the mainstream radio. And when they talk about politics, like on the news programs, they always say, well, the Democratic parties have discussed this, or the Democratic parties have decided this. So, but what do they mean by this, right?
Right.
What they mean is all the parties except the AfD. So, and these are government like radio stations, right? So obviously biased, right? Like they're insinuating that the AfD is somehow beyond the democratic pale, so to speak, even though the AfD has never said anything anti-democratic in its entire existence.
Yeah, well, there's no question that that the AfD has been marginalized. Let's come to them in just a moment.
Right. I just want to answer your question real quick, right? Because how do they address these problems? Well, they address them. I mean, they acknowledge that, okay, these problems exist. They usually just say, well, the problem is we don't have enough money, right? Like the state doesn't have enough money. So what do we need to do? We need to raise the pension age, right? Like from 65 to 70, it's being discussed.
Right.
We need to cut health insurance, state health insurance for families because we don't have enough money. It's always a question of money.
So it's a budgetary problem.
It's always framed as a budgetary problem, right? While at the same time, though, almost in the same paragraph, they say how many billions are now being sent to Ukraine for weapons, or how many billions are spent on the quote-unquote refugees or immigrants that are coming to Germany on a daily basis.
Right. Well, I don't think that sort of hypocrisy is lost on the German people, but we'll come to that in just a moment. One of the things that struck me when I was in Berlin several years ago, I was given a tour of the Bundestag and the Parliament building, all of which is brand new, relatively speaking, certainly newer in design than anything we have in the United States. And what I learned surprised me. The second largest parliament in the world is in Deutschland. It's in Germany. I mean, some 800, I think, members of parliament, something like that. Second only in size to China, by the way. So the question is, before we move on to AfD, who is in charge in Germany today? Who actually runs the parliament? What is this coalition that Merz presumably presides over?
Well, I think there's certain lobby groups and elites that pretty much are in all parties because, I mean, like I said, officially Germany is a multi-party system, and you have the Social Democrats who are essentially, like on the surface, they're socialists, and then you have the Christian Democratic Union who are more pro-capitalist. But in reality, de facto, it's a two-party system. You have all the parties, and then you have the AfD.
Right.
So I'll call it the unity party because nothing ever changes, right? Because the CDU has been in power not that long, like a year and a half, and before the CDU was in power, it was the Social Democrats who were in power and the Greens.
Yes.
But now you had the transition, but nothing has actually changed
Right.
in terms of policy at all,
right.
So, I mean, there's no resistance from like the CDU, the mainstream quote-unquote conservative party, against the homosexual agenda, against the transgender agenda, against the immigrant agenda. No real resistance, right? I mean, they say a lot, but they don't actually do anything.
An obvious analog to the Make America Great Again movement in the United States, which seems to be all bark and no bite. Well,
that's it, right?
Let's now talk about AfD, which is Alternative for Deutschland, because it seems, according to your own writing, that you think its growing popularity, its genesis, perhaps its rebranding, is very significant in German politics. Maybe it's a revitalization or signs that sovereignty is coming back in Germany. And this is what you say. This is from an article called The AfD and Germany's War Against the Voter. Quote, for foreign readers unfamiliar with German politics, the AfD began as a Eurosceptic party during the Euro crisis and gradually transformed into a broader nationalist opposition movement focused on immigration, sovereignty, cultural identity, energy policy, and criticism of the governing elite. Over time, especially in East Germany, the party developed into a mass political force capable of competing for state power. In several eastern states, the AfD now attracts levels of support that older establishment parties once considered impossible. This development terrified the German political establishment far more than any French protest movement ever could have, because it revealed something deeper. Millions of ordinary Germans had ceased believing the official narrative about the country's future. Question, who is the AfD? How did it come about? And what does it mean for Germany today?
Well, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, was originally founded, as you just mentioned, as a Eurosceptic party. It is basically originally was a libertarian party, like pro-capitalist and pro-sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, because they wanted to get rid of the euro and have a national currency again, like go back to the Deutschmark basically.
Right.
Also, I would say political sovereignty, because they were, as you said, Eurosceptic. They wanted Germany to leave the European Union, sort of like Brexit in England. There was no focus on immigration whatsoever in the early days of the AfD, and it was founded near Frankfurt, actually, in West Germany, the financial capital of Europe. And I think in 2015, when you had the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, when she opened like all the borders and let in like millions of people from Syria and
this is what,
Afghanistan.
2015, 2014?
Yeah, 2015, exactly.
Yep.
I think that's when the AfD sort of jumped on the bandwagon, right, and made immigration the central issue, and that's when they really took off.
So you think they, in terms of immigration at least, they responded
yes, it was a response.
Public sentiment rather than leading it?
Yes. Well, well, it didn't come from inside the AfD. I think they just, as I said, they seized the opportunity.
Interesting.
And they did it very well, because no other party did it at the time, no other mainstream party, because the AfD is literally, I mean, there are other nationalist or patriotic parties, but they're so small, they don't really matter.
Right.
So the AfD is a mainstream party, and now in the polls, the AfD at the moment is like 29-30% basically.
Which is
it's a number one party in Germany right now in the polls.
And give us some context, because as an American, 30%, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but in German parliamentarian politics.
Because you have the multi-party system, that's why. Because in America,
so it's huge. It's a big number.
Yeah, because like the CDU, which is like the governing party, Friedrich Merz's party, they're now at like 22%, right, or 23%. So the party is actually in power right now. Is at like 22%, the AfD is at 29%, that's a difference of 7%, 7 points. That's quite a lot, right? And 29%, that's like, I mean, every third German, basically. But then you have the sharp divide in Germany, right, between West Germany and East Germany, because I would say in East Germany, like Thuringia, for example, you're going to have some state elections this year. First one are going to be in September. The AfD has over 40%, right? Like 40, 45, 45%, almost 50%, potentially, in some eastern states. While in West Germany, it is usually below 20% in all states, like between 15 and 20%, right? So, and that's where the average comes from, because they're so high in the East, not as high in the West. That's why you have like 30%.
And give us some context. Right? Why are they stronger in the East than in West Germany?
Well, that's a whole topic, you know, and it's not so easy. I mean, different theories, nobody knows for sure. I mean, my own personal theory is because it's the phenomenon of all of Eastern Europe is basically more conservative, without exception. Basically, every single country that was in the Soviet sphere of influence, it is now socially conservative, including Russia.
Very interesting.
It's every single one.
Yeah.
It's like Romania, Poland, Hungary,
Yeah.
and East Germany, right?
Yes.
So the question is, why is it? Why is it?
Yeah.
And, well, I think it is because during the Cold War, the socialist camp, the Soviet camp, was more conservative than the Western camp. The Western camp obviously was mostly influenced by the United States, so you had all the Hollywood movies, McDonald's, Mickey Mouse, all the
Right.
homosexual agenda, all the degeneracy basically
Right.
flooded Western Europe. This obviously was not the case in Eastern Europe because it was behind the Iron Curtain. And
I see.
And
So you think they were to some
Yeah.
degree immunized,
right,
maybe?
yeah, definitely. I think in contrast to what many argue, especially in the United States, the Republican types, because they somehow equate like the Soviet Union with these like purple-haired weirdos from the Antifa today, but even those, I mean, they would have been in the Gulag, I would say, in the
Right.
Soviet Union, right?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the immunization, because I've heard another theory. You mentioned there's many, but I've heard that it's because they were exposed to Soviet authoritarianism, let's just call it that,
Right.
that they're very acutely sensitive to how it's manifesting in the West.
Yeah.
And they're hearing things that remind them of what it was before the Cold War ended. What say you about that?
Yeah, well, maybe it could. I mean, I'm familiar with this theory, but I
Yes.
think it is because they just grew up, especially in East Germany, in the
traditional.
German Democratic Republic was a more traditional society, and even in the communist times, the values of patriotism were highlighted by the state. I mean, the German Democratic Republic, to some extent, saw itself as a successor state to Prussia. They even re-erected
Right.
the statue of Frederick the Great in
Right.
East Berlin.
De Grosse.
And they celebrated the legacy of Martin Luther, the farmer revolts in the Middle Ages.
Right.
Thomas Münzer, like you have all these like positive role models in a real patriotic sense. Even the uniforms, the field gray uniforms they had in East Germany, well, in West Germany they copied the American uniforms, they had green ones. So you had a real sense of continuity in terms of German history and German culture, really only in East Germany and not in West Germany.
Is AfD then channeling the sovereign spirit of Germany, and on that basis, can that sense of sovereignty, which you and I know is a spirit, it's sort of a metaphysical property, can that spread to the rest of Germany? Is it infectious, or do you think it's contained?
Well, the AfD is sort of divided. You have like two factions, like you have a sort of like a West German faction and you have an East German faction. It's not a monolithic party. Like, for example, when you talk about the conflict in Ukraine, like you have certain AfD leaders, especially in West Germany, that are pro-American, pro-NATO, and quite anti-Russian, right? They think Ukraine needs even more weapons and needs to be supported to the hilt. While in East Germany, they're generally more favorable towards the Russian side, which actually reflects the general sentiment of the population, by the way.
Yes,
because
yeah.
I guess it's again because, I mean, they were in the Russian Soviet sphere of influence for decades, and it just became part of the mentality. Like people in East Germany, and I speak from personal experience as well, because now I live in West Germany, but I have a lot of friends in East Germany. It's a completely different world.
Right,
like you go
right.
to West Germany, you talk about things like ethnicity, race, sovereignty, nationalism,
Culture.
in a positive sense, right?
Yes.
If you do this in East Germany, people will turn around, they will attack you verbally. Like, what are you doing? That's completely unacceptable, blah, blah, blah. It's hate
Interesting.
speech. While in East Germany, the cafe, it's the complete opposite. The whole cafe will probably agree with you,
Yes.
right? And you can have a very normal conversation. In that sense, I would argue that in East Germany, the mentality is even closer to the Russian mentality, right? Because when I'm in Russia, and I lived in Russia for quite a long time, I feel quite free, right? Because the Russians generally have much more in common, say, even in the United States, like with the red states, you know, like the flyover country, so to speak, mentally, right?
I see.
And in terms of ideology. So you have this division in the AfD. It's not monolithic. And I think in West Germany, they don't push the idea of sovereignty as much as they do in East Germany, specifically because they also think that these supranational organizations like NATO are very important. The
I see.
transatlantic partnership with the United States is very important. While in East Germany, they talk about true sovereignty, and they think that the conflict in Ukraine is crucial to this. They think we basically need to stop supporting Ukraine, especially militarily, because it literally makes no sense having Russia as your nemesis.
Sure.
Especially if you want cheap Russian energy, because you want cheap Russian energy because it's absolutely vital for German industry. And also, culturally, you have to see the sort of connection between Germany and Russia. Like you have Catherine the Great, for example, was the German princess who became the Russian empress.
Right.
And the last Russian Tsar, he had a German wife from Darmstadt near Frankfurt. So, I mean, this sort of connection between Russians and Germans, also on a spiritual, philosophical level, runs very deep.
Like it's strong, yeah.
Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, you know. And Russians, by the way, they're extremely, in general, like very Germanophile.
Yeah.
Like I've traveled all over Russia, small towns, big cities, and I've virtually never encountered like any kind of hostility because I'm German. It was always the opposite. Usually I'm invited to drinks, yeah, great, Germany, you know.
Yes.
So they have this really positive image of Germany, while in Germany, in West Germany, is not the case. They demonize Russia all the time.
Although I would say, because I've traveled quite a bit too, and I was recently in Russia, I actually think Germans have a pretty good reputation everywhere outside of Germany.
Well, that's true.
with their own population.
Yeah, but they're ruining it though, right?
Yes,
with their policies.
Yes,
you know?
no, I understand.